Last year, I made a video talking about some obscure and interesting video game comic adaptations that have been released throughout the years, breaking them down and giving them a general overview for anyone that will be interested in reading them. And that video did pretty well, and honestly, it was a lot of fun delving into these really obscure pieces of the histories of those respected franchises. So today, I'm hopping back in the saddle and going at it again. I dug up 7 more obscure comic series based off of various video game franchises, and honestly, these ones might be even more obscure and wild than the last. So brace yourselves because we're diving right in headfirst. Last time I talked about video game comics, I had brought up 2 popular comics related to Sonic the Hedgehog, the original Archie run of the comics, and the modern IDW comic run that started a few years ago. But there is one other Sonic comic series that I did not include in that original video, and it is without a doubt the weirdest of the bunch. Fleetway Edition's Sonic the Comic, or as the community has affectionately referred to it as, the Fleetway Sonic run. This lesser-known comic was released by the UK publishing company Fleetway Editions, appropriately, in 1993, just 3 months after the release of the first issue of the Archie Sonic line, and ran until 2002. This comic series is fundamentally different from the rest, because it is heavily based on a lot of the older lore and aspects of the Sonic series before it got modernized for stuff like Sonic Adventure 1 or 2. For example, Sonic and Eggman's origin story are based entirely off of a one-shot promotional comic that was released alongside the first Sonic game, showcasing that Sonic was once a regular brown hedgehog and Robotnik was one Dr. Ivo Kintober, and both were turned into what you know them as today due to some hijinks involving chaos energy and a rotten egg. Yeah, I can start to see why Sega scrapped that origin story. As well as that, a lot of the characterizations of the classic characters are very similar to how they're portrayed in early games as well as the Archie comics. Sonic specifically is portrayed much more cocky and arrogant and has a lot of that radical 90s attitude that he was associated with before they slowly got rid of that as time moved on. The comics run towards the beginning seem to be very similar to how the Archie comics started out, telling inconsequential one-off stories of his adventures while also making adaptations of the games whenever they came out. Pretty basic stuff. But as more issues came out, the similarities between this and the Archie comics began to become less and less frequent. And the first red flag is probably what you all associate this comic with nowadays, and that's Sonic's super form. Yeah, instead of just being a standard super form for Sonic, Fleetway's take on the supersonic transformation is radically different from any other iteration of the character. He's portrayed as this wild, almost demon-like entity that serves as an alter ego for Sonic, and is basically just this unstoppable menace that he constantly has to keep in check. He's basically what would happen if you took the concept of Dark Sonic and gave him the personality of Scourge from the Archie comics. The character and design are so prominent and popular that most people only even know about these comics through this transformation, to the point where the form is just titled Fleetway Supersonic in most online discussion. It's so prominent, in fact, that it was able to make its way into the late 2000s, early 2010s Sonic mythos when all those Super Mario Bros. Z-style sprite animations were everywhere. Fleetway Supersonic is without a doubt the most memorable part of this comic, and it's kind of easy to see why. The trope of a goody two-shoes protagonist having some kind of dark or evil transformation that they struggle to control is something that people usually latch onto pretty quickly. So it makes sense that the idea of Sonic having this evil, sadistic alter ego to him that came out whenever he used the Chaos Emerald stuck with the hearts of a lot of Sonic fans. Besides the core group of Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Robotnik, other Sonic characters would eventually make their own appearances like the Chaotix, Amy, and even Sally Acorn from the cartoon, though she looks vastly different from any other version I've seen. Metal Sonic, or Metalix as he's called in this, who basically pulls an Ultron and forms an entire army of himself, which is pretty cool. Even Chaos, who serves as basically the final villain of this comic, though he is absolutely nothing like his game counterpart. There was also tons of original characters as well, kind of similar to the Archie comics again, or the IDW for that matter, trying to implement some new characters alongside the established cast, even having their own group of freedom fighters, which makes me wonder if Fleetway copied some of the aspects of the Archie comic run, which was running alongside them. In any case, instead of characters we all know and love now, like Sally Acorn and Antoine, we have characters like Techno the Canary, Captain Plunder, Short Fuse the Cybernick, and then Bugs Bunny and Porky Pig?
What's up, Doc?
Yeah, as you can tell, the cast from Fleetway didn't stick as well as the ones from the Archie comics. The comic basically ends with its own rendition of Sonic Adventure, in that it had absolutely nothing to do with the original game, alongside borrowing some very specific story beats because the plot at this point was so disconnected from any established game lore that trying to fit them together was basically impossible. Supersonic, who had become his own entity at this point, had killed Bugs Bunny, rest in peace, absorbs all of Chaos's power, who had absorbed the 7 Chaos Emeralds by this point, turns into whatever this thing is, and basically slaps everyone around before this Catwoman merges him and Blue Sonic back together, basically locking Supersonic back into the OG Sonic's body. And that's it. The comic would continue for a few more issues, but it was just reprints of already existing stories. This was the end of Fleetway Sonic's run. Honestly, despite how absolutely wild it is for how far away it strays from the source material, I do respect this comic for doing its own unique thing with the Sonic lore. This was at a time before huge established lores and big backstories for characters were commonplace, and the only games these comics had to go off of were the original 3 on the Sega Genesis. So it's interesting to see such a different look on the Sonic universe, even though it is a bit strange. Nowadays, this comic is only really remembered for the super form trope it introduced, which is fair. I think it is an interesting concept to explore in Sonic, even though I don't think we'd ever get something like that now. But Sonic's more recent form in Frontiers does share some design features with it, so that's kinda cool. Oh boy, another Pokemon manga, who would've guessed? I mean, are you really that surprised? Pokemon actually has a surprising amount of different manga series that have been published throughout its run as a franchise. Everything from Pokemon Adventures, which I covered last time, to manga adaptations of the anime movies, and also a manga version of the latest season Pokemon Journeys. But that's not what we're talking about today. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Adventures, not to be confused with the Diamond and Pearl portion of the Pokemon Adventures manga, had its first issue debut in 2008, which was 2 years after the original Diamond and Pearl games came out, and the same year that Pokemon Platinum did. Surprisingly, despite this being one of the more, well, I wouldn't say popular, but more well-known Pokemon manga out there isn't really a lot of information out there about the inception of this manga and how it came to be, or any kind of behind-the-scenes knowledge, honestly. Both Bulbapedia and Wikipedia have very little knowledge about this manga except for the plot synopsis and just general information, and that the author and the illustrator for the manga had worked on a different manga for Pokemon in the past called Pokemon Battle Frontier. The manga follows Harita, the main character, and it's basically what would happen if you took Kid Goku and made him a Pokemon trainer, because he has the same attitude and personality as one of those kinds of protagonists. He's tasked by Professor Rowan, his adopted grandfather, to set out and find the legendary Pokemon Dialga. He travels with Mitsumi, Rowan's assistant and this series' stand-in for Dawn, and meets various other characters along his travels like June, who is basically just Barry if he was a simp, and Koya, who's just edgy, I guess. I don't really remember him that much. Truth be told, last time I read this manga, I was in like middle school, so I remember very little about the overall plot besides like a few key details, so there is a lot of stuff here that I had completely forgotten about. Though I do remember pretty clearly the fact that Harita was able to catch Regigigas and get that on his team, which is pretty cool. Upon my revisiting of this manga back when I used to read it as a kid, I was surprised to see how great the art had aged. The style is distinctly different from stuff like Adventures or any other Pokemon manga, and the way the Pokemon are drawn all look genuinely fantastic. And all of the characters and Pokemon are really expressive and the action's all really clean. The plot just follows the story of the Diamond and Pearl games as to be expected, but similarly to Adventures, it takes its own unique twists and turns to spice it up a bit. What I also do remember is that this manga is much more indulgent in more adult humor. Not super bad adult humor, but the type of humor that you would expect from your typical shonen anime like Naruto or Dragon Ball. They do spend a surprising amount of time getting you familiar and bonded with the characters, which is a really good call in my opinion. These are protagonist characters from Pokemon after all. You kind of have to give them personality and character for them to be any level of interesting in a manga setting. And honestly, I'd say they did a really good job. Harita, despite basically just being Kid Goku, is really energetic and sometimes really funny. And Mitsumi is a greatly endearing but also really tragic character. And Jun is, honestly, I don't remember much about him. Other characters from the original game make their appearance here as well. All the Team Galactic heads, the gym leaders, Charon, Cynthia, Riley, they're all here. No surprises there. There's some stuff later in the story involving Giratina and Deoxys and Stark Mountain and a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm going to refrain from touching on the bigger plot details just in case anyone watching wants to read it blind. It is only 8 volumes worth, and in my opinion, it is a great take on the story of these games. I don't know if it's better than the Pokemon Adventures version of Diamond and Pearl. I'd have to read them both to compare them, and it's been a while since I've read either. But I think that this manga has a lot of great things in it, and is absolutely worth your time if you're a Pokemon and a manga fan. Yes, this is a real thing. No, I am not sorry. Everyone remembers the huge cultural impact that Among Us had in 2020. Coming in at the perfect time during the COVID days and was fun for a few months before everyone over the age of 10 dropped it and moved on. But apparently, Innersloth decided, you know what, let's make it a manga. And then bada bing bada boom, now we have an Among Us manga. The manga was a one-shot issue that debuted during April of 2022 under Koro Comics, a Japanese comic corporation that was behind the release of Doraemon, but now regularly serializes and publishes manga based off of established video games. We have them to thank actually for the manga series I talked about previously, like Pokémon Adventures and the Splatoon manga. So that's pretty cool. The manga itself doesn't have anything too crazy to talk about. It's just a lighthearted comedy one-shot set in a game of Among Us. The characters banter, they discover the imposter, one of them has Josuke's pompadour for some reason. I couldn't find any real details about the plot, but from what I can gather, they treat it somewhat like an isekai where they go into the game. I'm not sure. Frankly, this is only on here not necessarily because of what's in the manga, and more so because of the fact that it exists at all. Still, the fact that these people were able to turn Among Us, of all things, into a cohesive manga narrative is really impressive to me, and if they can do that, then they could make a manga out of freaking anything. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an Undertale comic come out under Korokoro within the next few years. Ever wonder what would happen if Kratos fought Superman? Well, think no longer, friends, because DC already beat you to it. Well, not really. Not too long after the release of the first God of War game, DC Comics partnered up with the God of War team to create a 6-part miniseries of comics written by Marv Wolfman, a successful comic book writer who was the writer behind various Teen Titan and Teen Titan related stories, Superman, Batman, Blade, and, you know, Batman Arkham Knight and Crisis on Infinite Earths. If anyone was going to handle a comic series based on God of War, it was going to be him. The story of these 6 issues is very straightforward. The first part is a flashback to before Kratos became the monstrously powerful demigod that we know him as today, and takes place before the events of the first game. Then it jumps to immediately after the first God of War game, unsurprisingly, and after Kratos was deemed the God of War after he gave Ares the good old stabby stab. And Kratos is tasked with finding some super ambrosia that has unrivaled healing powers or something. The plot is super simple, and that's fine. It seems cool since the flashback sequence involves Kratos battling against mortal champions of the Olympian gods that they had also sent after the same ambrosia Kratos was after, and the main plot involves Kratos battling against Gygas, the guy with the ring that Tolkien definitely didn't snatch for his own story. Anyways, super simple, super fun, all there is to it, right? Well, apparently not. Were you hearing me talk about these older God of War comics and thought, man, I wish there were some comics based on the newer God of War games? Well, worry not, because Dark Horse Comics has got you covered. Dark Horse is, surprise surprise, a comic book publishing company who are behind some adaptations of other famous properties like Stranger Things and The Witcher, and also being the publishers of the Hellsing manga? Anyways, they also made a series of comic books based on God of War, this time based around the new, modern era of the franchise, with the collection of books taking place before the events of the PlayStation 4 God of War game from what I can gather. For some reason, despite these comics still being fully available for purchase on the Dark Horse store, I couldn't actually find any decent plot synopsises of these books, besides the summary that's given on the Dark Horse store for the specific books. But apparently, Kratos and Atreus in this small series of issues deal with everything from berserk cults to bear cults to mystic seers to more bears. Like I said, I could not track down any decent description of the plot, but it seems like a fun read. The art is definitely worthy of note. All the covers of each book are really well made and are definitely worth checking out the comic just for that alone. And the best part is, these comics are still up for purchase right now. One of the unfortunate things about some of these comics is that some of them are so old that it's hard to really track down or purchase physical copies without spending an obscene amount of money. So it is nice that these comics are still available from the official publishing companies. So if you're a fan of God of War and need that little bit of extra content after beating Ragnarok, maybe give these a try. As if it didn't already have enough spin-offs, Kingdom Hearts has a manga. Initially published in 2003, then updated and republished in 2007, this manga mainly just follows the story of the original game from my understanding, and spans all the way through from Kingdom Hearts 1 to Kingdom Hearts 3, even covering some of the weird spin-offs along the way. It's pretty similar to Pokémon Adventures and Legend of Zelda in that sense, since it's basically the exact same story, just mangafied, which is becoming a common trend with these videos, but I can see why they do it. Kingdom Hearts just by itself is a very anime-ish series just in terms of its plot, themes, and designs, so it makes sense why they'd think it would fit well in a manga format. The only thing not really anime about it is the fact that you have the genie from Aladdin and Mickey Mouse running around, but besides that, it's perfect. Oh yeah, the cast of Final Fantasy VII is here too. I was kind of aware that Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts were linked in some way, and not just by their development companies. And I knew that Cloud and Sephiroth were involved in the first game, but seeing them here in this manga art style is really cool. And similarly to the Kingdom Hearts cast, fit the format really well. Oh yeah, the art is also great. It's very lighthearted in tone, which I think is fitting for the series we're talking about, and it seems like it has a lot of great comedic moments sprinkled throughout from what I could find. Still, it is funny just by itself to see Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck in a manga like this. They look great and on model, but there's still something very off about seeing them in this style. Regardless of that, it seems like a faithful adaptation to the franchise. I personally never got into the Kingdom Hearts series since understanding the plot by itself requires more of a commitment than any JRPG could wish to achieve. But maybe this would be a better way for me to get introduced to the series. Or not, if any Kingdom Hearts aficionados want to fill me in. But for any big Kingdom Hearts fans, maybe give this one a go if you'd want to experience a story you like in a manga form. So you guys remember Nintendo Power, right? Of course you don't, not even I'm old enough to remember that. For those of you who are unaware, Nintendo Power was a magazine officially published by Nintendo themselves. It was basically an older, specifically Nintendo version of Game Informer. It gave you news on upcoming games, gave you strategies on other games, etc, etc. And one of those things that they put in those magazines were comic books. The one that everyone is probably the most familiar with is the Super Mario Bros. Adventure series, aka the one where Princess Peach dresses up as Luigi to save Luigi. I think it was Luigi, which was serialized through the magazine. But one series I'm sure you didn't know about was their Star Fox comic line, released in February of 1993. Now, one of the more interesting things I learned about this comic while researching it is that it actually predates the original Star Fox game, making this comic the very first appearance of Fox McCloud and all of his pals, which you can tell with these very old-looking designs that aren't really associated with the character's more modern looks. The plot isn't anything too crazy, just your classic 90s space action shenanigans. There are a few original characters in there as well, and their designs are just as on par with the original characters of the Archie Sonic comics. The two notable ones are just love interests of some of the main characters. There's Slippy's girlfriend, Crokella, really creative naming convention there, guys, and Farah Phoenix, who, yeah, I'm starting to miss Bugs Bunny from the Fleetway comics at this point. There's also Vixie Reynard, who's Fox's mom and has probably the funniest story in this entire comic. So, basically, James McCloud, who was called Fox McCloud Sr. in this comic, was married to this girl fox named Vixie. But Andros, the giant floating monkey head who's one of the main villains of Star Fox, and is the main villain of this comic, was also in love with Vixie. But Vixie was already in love with James at this point. So Andros says, I know, I'll hide a bomb in James's car so when he goes out on his next drive, he'll blow up. That way Vixie will have no choice but to love me. Unfortunately for Andros, he didn't account for the fact that people borrow each other's cars sometimes. So instead of James getting in the car next, Vixie did, and unfortunately it led to her getting blown to smithereens. Nice going, dude. God, the 90s were hilarious. But yeah, besides that, there's not really a lot to this one. Just another interesting and wacky facet of Nintendo's past. I actually had a hard time finding any amount of images for this one. I guess because this one's so old and not as popular or memorable as other more popular comics from this era, it kind of slipped into obscurity. Which is kind of a shame and really could be said for Star Fox as a whole, to be honest. So you all know Elden Ring, right? FromSoft's latest banger, one game of the year of 2022, has sold over 23 million copies worldwide, has some highly anticipated DLC coming out later this year. Yeah, that Elden Ring. And as with anything popular, it got a manga adaptation. Elden Ring Road to the Erdtree debuted in 2022, originally online on its own personal website, and later debuted physically in 2023. And was actually the main reason I decided to make this video, because I saw one of these volumes in a Barnes & Noble once and thought that this opportunity was too good to pass up. Written by Nikichi Tobita, this manga basically just recaps the story of the original game that we're all familiar with. Now, I know what you're thinking. Given that this is a FromSoft Souls game we're talking about, you're probably expecting something very dark and gritty with a heavy focus on violence and fighting. Something to rival that of Berserk or Vinland Saga. Oh my sweet summer child, you have no idea what you're in store for. This is no action-based dark fantasy story you're expecting. This is an Elden Ring gag manga.
What?
The name of the first chapter is literally called You Thought This Would Be Serious. They knew exactly what the mission was and they did not hold back. The main character, Aseo, is an absolute moron that stumbles his way from plot point to plot point and somehow manages to survive each time, which is indicative of my own personal Elden Ring experience, by the way. And while I personally haven't read all of this manga yet, watching him stumble his way through these bosses that terrified me on my first playthrough is nothing short of hysterical. Weirdly enough, despite its odd premise, I don't hate the concept. Similarly to other games that have a silent, strong, stoic protag, subverting the expectations and making the main character a complete moron is actually a pretty ingenious move. Since I feel like if they did make the main character a Guts or Kenshiro type character, the story would be very boring. Elden Ring is a game that always takes itself very seriously, but it works because the world is so immersive that you feel invested in its environments and its characters. But when you take that interactive aspect out of it and put it into something like a manga, you lose a lot of the magic that gets you so invested. And I think deciding to make up for it by doubling down on the gag thing and making the protagonist a complete idiot is, in my opinion, pretty ingenious. Plus, from what I read, they do know when to take a scene seriously or to lean towards a more humorous tone. The entire Radon fight is played 100% straight, and it's honestly really cool. They give a lot more depth and development to a lot of the NPCs that don't get really a lot of time to shine outside of whatever related side quests they have, so seeing them interact with Aseo is pretty fun. There's also some pretty decent art in there as well. It's a bit too realistic for my tastes, but I can't deny that the artist behind it is undoubtedly talented at what he does, and all the characters from the game fit pretty well into his art style. Aseo, the main character, is pretty entertaining from what little I've read. He's a perfect blend of lovable idiot and, dare I say, cool. He has that kind of Goku or Naruto thing about him where he's kind of aloof in day-to-day goings, but when it comes to battles and fights, he has a strange sense of combat intelligence. It's strange, but again, it's too entertaining for me not to like it. But besides that, there's really nothing else of note within this manga besides its funny premise. It's currently still going, and like I said, it has its own website where you can read the first 2 chapters and also the most recent chapters for free. So if you'd like to visit that website and read it yourself, I recommend it. Honestly, I think a lot of Elden Ring fans will get a kick out of this one, since it's kind of similar to watching a Twitch streamer play Elden Ring for the first time, and I know people like doing that. And also, watching how these people mess around with the world of Elden Ring in comedic ways is also bound to be entertaining. And I think that's about all I got for you today on weird video game comics. While I enjoyed making the last video quite a bit, I think this one was slightly more enjoyable, simply because I got to dive even deeper into this strange yet fascinating rabbit hole and discover even more obscure series that I don't even think the most diehard fans would know about. Like, how many fans of Star Fox are aware that there was a comic that came out that predated the original game? That's why I like making these kinds of videos so much. It allows me to dive more into the niche and unknown aspects of the histories of all these famous franchises and share it with people who might be unaware. Obviously, some of these are more well known than others, like the Fleetway comics, but it's always fun exploring these fun comic series and discovering whatever weird adventures lie within them. And I'm sure that there are enough left out there for me to make another 5 videos out of it, so I'll probably make more in the future. In any case, that's about all from me. Thank you guys so much for watching. Check out my last video on video game comic books if you haven't already, and I'll catch y'all later.